Welcome back to Inquiry into Workplace Drug Testing in Victoria. Thank you so much. We also got people, two groups joining us for this session. Is the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapy and 360 Edge. We got Professor Iain McGregor, Dr. Danielle McCartney, and Dr. Katinka van de Van, if I pronounced that right.
That was perfect.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before I continue, I'll just read some information regarding evidence you're going to present to us today. Regarding the evidence you're providing today, all evidence taken is protected by public privilege as provided by Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the provision of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing. Those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberate false evidence or misleading of the community may be considered contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You'll be provided a approved version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee website. Again, thank you, Professor and Doctors. Just a quick introduction of the committee before we proceed. My name is Chung Liu, I'm the Chair. My Deputy Chair is Mr. Ryan Batchelor, Mr. Rachel Payne,
Hello.
Mr. David Eggerstank, Dr. Sarah Mansfield, and also we got Dr. Renee Heath joining us on Zoom as well, if you heard the noise before. I know you both group has made submission, but I'll open up for each of you to make an opening statement before I open the committee to ask a question. So if you'd like to start, Professor, we'll go with you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence today.
Oh, sorry, before to interrupt you, could you state your full name and organisation you're representing, just for record purpose, please? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Professor Iain McGregor, and I'm the Academic Director of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today and for the opportunity to make a submission. The Lambert Initiative is a philanthropically funded research centre that examines the medical potential, the therapeutic potential of cannabis and related molecules, cannabinoids from the cannabis plant. We do a lot of very basic research, the chemistry and pharmacology. We also run a lot of clinical trials with cannabis-based medicines. And we also liaise a lot with patients within the community who use medicinal cannabis products and the doctors that prescribe these products to patients. One of the things that we've learned along the way is that there's a great deal of concern around the issue of impairment, and that concern comes from doctors who are prescribing this product. It comes from employers who have employees who are using medicinal cannabis products, and it comes from patients themselves who are often concerned that they may well be impaired in the workplace or when driving a motor vehicle. And so we readily identified several years ago that the issue of cannabis-based impairment in the workplace and on the road was a key concern for everyone around medicinal cannabis. And we therefore launched a lot of research into this area. My colleague Danielle McCartney, who's with us today, has led a lot of that research on behalf of the Lambert Initiative and also the group at Swinburne University. Dr. Thomas R. Kell, who was previously with the Lambert Initiative, has led this research too. We've also engaged quite a lot with industry, both in Australia and overseas, and I've given a lot of medical, legal, expert witness advice around impairment in the workplace. This has been a major concern in Canada, where I've given evidence, particularly in the transportation industry. For example, the Toronto Transit Commission had a major arbitration case around the rights of their employees to use cannabis-based medicines in the workplace. And more recently, we've engaged with unions in Western Australia and New South Wales who are in a situation where their employees appear to be discriminated against or risk dismissal or have actually been dismissed as a result of legitimate cannabis-based medicine prescriptions that they've been taking, often declaring to their employer that they're actually using these medicines. So we perceive a conundrum at the moment. The industry, both in Australia and overseas, seems a little bit uncertain about how to manage this issue. And of course, we have massive escalation in the numbers of people who are legitimately using cannabis-based medicines, not just in Australia, but overseas. So scientists love a conundrum. I mean, we get paid to solve these problems. And so we can't promise a solution, but we certainly have quite a refined viewpoint of the science underlying cannabis-based impairment, and we like to think that we're world leaders in this area at the moment.
Thank you. Dr. Katinka, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yeah, and also just to then state that I'm Katinka van der Ven and I'm a principal consultant at 360 Edge. So actually, it's really interesting how societal views of alcohol use during work hours has changed. I actually remember that my dad told me, who was a psychiatrist for the Dutch military, that during his time, when he was stationed in Germany, that it was really normal to drink a glass of wine during lunch. And something actually which, in most workplaces is not tolerated anymore, which is a good thing. The question here today is whether drug testing is the way forward to dealing with workers who use alcohol or drugs. I would like to thank the Council for providing 260 Edge with the opportunity to speak about workplace drug testing in Victoria. 260 Edge is Australia's leading specialist alcohol and other drug consultancy, with workplace testing being a particular area of expertise. So we know that 67% of people who use illicit drugs are employed. Most, however, only do it a couple times a year and do not use drugs at risky levels that would interfere with their ability to carry out work duties. There's also an increasing number of people who use prescribed cannabinoids, stimulants, and opioids for a wide range of medical conditions. So between 2020 and 2024, over 480,000 applications to access medicinal cannabis were approved. So regardless of being illicit or medicinal, no workplace drug testing are available to detect intoxication or impairment other than alcohol breathalyzer tests, which has been mentioned by many people today and yesterday. They also cannot detect when a worker has used the drugs, how much they used, or the frequency that they're using it. Someone can return a positive test for cannabis that they've used weeks before taking the test, long after the potential impairing effects of cannabis have worn out. And as a meta-regression analysis from the Lambert initiative actually shows, people using medicinal cannabis are able to perform work duties after 8 hours of consuming it. Most people will still return a positive test after 8 hours, though. So the link between drug test results and impairment is weak. And when factoring in other workplace risks, it's clear that drug tests are actually not a useful tool to mitigate workplace health and safety risks. There's actually a range of workplace environmental personal risk factors that can impact workplace health and safety. So, for example, heat or poor equipment maintenance or mental health issues. So drug testing exposes workers to risks of being discriminated against solely for using drugs when there's a range of other factors that contribute to risk of workplace injury. There's very limited high-quality evidence that workplace drug testing deters workers from using drugs or reduces alcohol and drug-related workplace injuries. Workplace drug testing can even result in unintended negative consequences, including workers modifying their drug-taking behaviors to avoid detection and being less likely to report minor accidents and near misses to avoid a test. There's no valid rationale to support workplace drug testing in workers whose potential alcohol and drug use presents no risk to workplace health and safety. So the only exception for when drug testing is warranted is for the entry of high-risk work sites to protect workers from serious harms. So, for example, people working in mining who have to operate heavy machinery. And workplaces in Victoria, but the problem is that now workplaces in Victoria may respond differently to test results. And responses to positive test results for cannabis, when when the worker has had a prescription are also really diverse, ranging from being referred to counseling to instant dismissal. And the lack of regulation around this places many workers at risk of being sanctioned for taking a prescribed medication without any evidence of impairment. Someone, who had a mental health incident will also pose a risk to safety, would not be sanctioned, but would, for example, be sent home to focus on their recovery. So if the purpose of alcohol and other drug testing is health and safety, sanctions are not the way to go for people who test positive. In every workplace, a health approach needs to be at the front and center. A health approach towards drug use, whether used illicit or prescribed, can both improve safety of workplaces and also provide support for those using illicit and prescribed medications. Workplaces that do have a drug testing regime need to be based on best practice principles. This includes undertaking comprehensive risk assessments, including workplace risks influencing use, such as a workplace culture. A positive test should not result in direct dismissal and instead result in support. Procedures must be carried out fairly and consistently, and testing should be restricted to the least intrusive methods available. This approach is also in line with a general move by governments away from sanctions for drug use and towards a health approach, for example, through diversion to treatment rather than arrest. So a shift in the way prescribed and illicit drugs are dealt with in the workplace towards a more health-based approach would be in line with the approach to drugs in the community and community expectations. So to sum up, drug testing cannot determine impairment. It presents a risk of discrimination. There's a wide range of workplace, environmental, and personal risk factors that can impact workplace health and safety, and a health approach needs to be at the front and center. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katinka. Dr. Danielle McCartney, do you like to make an opening statement, or are we happy to go straight to question?
I'm happy to go straight to questioning. I think Iain covered our submission and the Lambert initiative really well.
Thank you very much. I'll direct my first question to Professor, if I could, please, Professor. Basically, the inquiries basically will try to establish a safe workplace. A workplace is the employers' rights and employees' rights and employers' requirements on occupational health safety. Now, in your submission, you mentioned that THC induced impairment from your research and also there's evidence shows that patients showing medicinal cannabis produce unlikely pose of safety risks. Could you just expand less into the amount of THC in the medicinal medicines which cause the impairment? Because we have a lot of issue with the term of impairment being thrown around with various submissions.
Yes, thank you. It's a tricky question that you posed. The traditional approach in my field of psychopharmacology is to get people into the laboratory, and Danielle is a leading person in the world for doing this kind of research. But we can administer THC or CBD or other cannabinoids. And then there's a whole bunch of different cognitive or psychomotor tests, things like, balancing reaction time, the ability to recall digits or phrases, a whole lot of specialized tests that are variously sensitive to the effects of THC. Some are more sensitive than others. But basically, we've had a cottage industry in psychology and psychopharmacology of doing, dozens of different trials around the impairing effects of cannabis and its main psychoactive ingredient, THC, on these tests. And Danielle is the world leader, and I might actually defer to her and just, she can tell you what she found out when she reviewed basically every study that had ever been done on different types of impairment. So maybe over to you, Danielle.
Oh, thanks, Iain. As Iain's already explained, these studies, we typically bring people in the lab and can administer a whole range of different types of tasks. When we conducted a review of those studies, I think we identified 80 since 2020 that had administered THC or cannabis in some form or another, and then went on to conduct some form of assessment of impairment. And we sort of brought all that data together, extracted it from all the different papers, and attempted to determine, as you say, how impaired someone was following given intake of cannabis or THC. And we ended up breaking the data down into sort of our two main kind of routes of administration. So we had our inhaled cannabis sort of studies and our oral THC administration. And we found that both tended to elicit similar amounts of impairment, if that's what you would say. We quantified impairment in a metric called Hedges G, which I won't delve into too much, but suffice to say that the magnitude of impairment we were seeing was considered sort of moderate on that scale with oral and inhaled THC. Then what we were interested in was the effect of dose and also time following cannabis or THC administration on that magnitude of impairment. And when we ran all the analyses, firstly, we tended to find that impairment from inhaled THC or cannabis tended to subside within sort of comfortably within 8 hours, often less if the dose was less, and comfortably within sort of 10 hours of oral THC. Sorry, this is getting confusing, of oral THC if the dose, depending on the dose as well. I'm a little bit lost in what the question was now.
Well, it's kind of nailing down impairment. And I think the three things that stuck in my mind were that, first of all, you take an oral THC medicine, so like a cannabis oil containing THC, it's a different time course of impairment. So it creeps up quite slowly. You get peak impairment, say, at about 2 hours, whereas with inhaled cannabis, you're impaired within 5 minutes. And then the inhaled cannabis tends to wear off more quickly, whereas the oral THC creeps up more slowly and lasts a bit longer. So the dose is an important determinant as well. So higher doses, you're impaired for longer. But probably the most important thing that came out of this huge analysis that Danielle did was that it's very much dependent upon how experienced you are as a cannabis user. So it's actually very difficult to show impairment in people who are daily, regular users of cannabis. Nearly all of the laboratory studies, for whatever reason, have been done in occasional cannabis users, often uni students, who have a bit of cannabis once a month or once every couple of months. And so if you're in that category, then you're likely to be much more impaired because you have no tolerance towards THC. So these were the three determinants: the route of administration, oral versus smoke, the dose of THC that you're taking, and whether you're a routine user. And the last point is really important for medical users, which is your main interest with this inquiry. And it's actually really quite hard with people who are using cannabis every day and often to alleviate a medical condition such as chronic pain or insomnia. It's actually really quite hard to show any sort of impairment when they're using THC-based products in the manner that their prescribing physician has instructed them to use such products.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor, that's a very insightful lesson to the study you did. Quickly jump to, I know that the committee will have a lot more questions for you. Quickly jump to Dr. Katinka. You mentioned about drug testing will have an adverse effect. Now, you also mentioned about stress, fatigue. All those do have some sort of mitigation strategy at the moment if the employer wished to implement them. But relation to high-risk work site, not the overall manufacturing, just the high-risk area, what do you suggest if you don't think work testing is a proper tool to eliminate the risk factor? What do you suggest those sector be doing to address the risk issue relation to the employee might be whether it's prescribed or not prescribed medications?
Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the question. Are you asking me to think through when potentially testing is justified in certain areas?
No, I'm not. Just saying, just relation to the risks in high-risk work site. You mentioned there's various factors like stress, heat, fatigue.
Yeah.
I'm saying those
Yeah.
factors, we have strategy to implement to address those if they subject to those areas. But with drugs, at the moment, drug testing has been used to identify who's at risk. If you reckon if your submission is drug testing is counterproductive, I'm just asking what's your recommendation those sectors should be using or what methods should they be doing?
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying that. So just to confirm, I do. We do drug testing in general is not very effective, and just as a quick side note, even in certain safety-sensitive areas where potentially drug testing would be justified, it is still very important that then comes with a very comprehensive alcohol and other drug policy. But having said that, what is really important is that alcohol and other drugs is actually not that different in relation to other factors like mental health or fatigue. And basically, you need to think to this in the same sense of a fit for work policy, where you can outline all those different areas that potentially are a risk to the health, safety and well-being and the performance of a worker, where actually drugs could be outlined as well as one of those things that can influence health, risk and safety. And what is really important though is that drug testing seems a little bit as the easy way out. So in the sense that, for workers, it is an easy thing to do. We can implement a test and then we can see the presence of the drugs and then we can make steps based on that. But to be honest, there's a lot of workplace conditions that actually can influence these risks and even also increase the risk of people using a substance. So what is really important is that we actually look at those workplace conditions and the culture around it that can influence substance use as well. But that is, of course, that's much harder and that's probably also much more cost intensive to think through those kind of mechanisms. And as an example, someone yesterday within the inquiry mentioned that some people are making these 18-hour shifts for 20 days straight. So what we need to do here, and as a risk that potentially those people were using substances to get through their shift. So what we need to do here is actually identify these risks of all those factors that potentially can impact the health and safety of the workplace and address that in a holistic way. So we need to understand, okay, what kind of pressures are people experiencing within their place? How are they contributing to an increased risk of use? How can all those factors also contribute to can affect the health and safety of the workplace? So, and then support those people to be able to function within a place where in the workplace in which support always should be at the forefront. And also, one of the things that we probably should be focusing more also on, because it was also mentioned, and the problem is that people are making these long shifts because they potentially have to pay these medical bills. So if we're going to put steps in place to safeguard the health and safety of these workers, and taking hours away because we want to ensure that they're not too stressed or that they are tired and therefore that would impact their performance, that also then potentially could add financial stress to these people. So actually then you should probably be thinking about making sure that people get enough paid and that they're fairly compensated. But these are much more higher level things that we need to think about that are at the roots of alcohol and other drugs. So in general we need to think about about policies and how to relate how to deal with this, where in alcohol and other drugs is an area that can impact health and safety and performance.
Even in high-risk area where there's immediate action might cause fatal or injuries to another person?
So I do think that there is for certain safety-sensitive industries, there is potential where there is a high risk of injuries. For example, with mining, where people are using heavy machinery. There is justification to use drug testing, but even that needs to be supported with a policy. And also what you need to do is really think through the unintended consequences. So as I believe it was John from the Pennington Institute also mentioned, 20 years ago when we looked at mining and when they were testing for cannabis, we saw actually a shift to people starting to use meth because the detection window was less, which potentially, is a more harmful substance than cannabis. So, even where potentially testing is justified, we really need to be very careful as to, okay, we need to think this through so people are not shifting, for example, to more harmful substances. And also what we see is that there is a risk that people will actually stop reporting minor incidents because they don't want to be tested. So even where testing is implemented, we need to make sure that there is a very comprehensive policy where support is at the forefront for these people. So we sit down, we analyze what kind of factors are influencing the performance of the worker, of which alcohol and other drugs is one thing, and also need to think through, okay, so what is potentially causing alcohol and other drug use or risky use within that worker, and need to address that holistically.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, everyone, for the evidence. Just going back to the studies, Professor McGregor. So clearly we've got some evidence that there is evidence that impairment occurs following the consumption of cannabis in some users, but that the sort of variables include method and then length of impairment. The science is very good at telling us things. We've got to translate that into public policy questions, and often, particularly at a rule-making, policy-making, but even public messaging level, we have to strip away complexity and get to simplicity so that we can effectively set messages, right? Do you think that things like time-based exclusion periods would be a better form of messaging about when people should regard themselves to be the possibility of subject to impairment following consumption of cannabis products?
Yes, I think that is a very rational approach in terms of providing public health advice. We just did a study actually up in Canberra because it's legal to cultivate up there. So we had more than 400 cannabis cultivators and we asked them a whole range of questions. And it was quite cool because we actually grabbed some of the cannabis as well and checked the THC content and looked at pesticides and heavy metals and all sorts of stuff. The cannabis checked out pretty well, but what I'm getting at is quite interesting. That Danielle did an analysis of the time they waited before they would drive a motor vehicle. And it was kind of binary. There was people that basically would not drive a motor vehicle for at least 8 hours after their cannabis use, and there's others that would drive readily within 1 hour. And so there's this kind of bifurcation into what you might call a high risk and an extremely risk averse group. But I think what we can use the work that Danielle's done to do is provide nuanced advice to cannabis users and say, well, if you're inhaling cannabis at this particular dose, then chances are within 4 or 5 hours, you're probably good to drive. You're probably okay. But let's be ultra cautious and call that 8 or 10 hours. If you're working on a mine site and you're prescribed a THC-based medicine, then it's probably fine. I mean, what the evidence is telling us is it's okay to use that by night to help with your pain and help you sleep, but don't take it first thing in the morning before you attend work. And I think these are very common sense interventions that are evidence-based and that could provide a much more nuanced public health message around medicinal cannabis use and recreational cannabis use for that matter.
Nuance is helpful
nuance is very helpful
in individual circumstances, but we've got like a public policy question that is hard to nuance down to that level. How do you think we land that plane at a place where we can have something that understands the science, but also has a policy and public health messaging framework that has universal application?
Yes, I mean, I've been very much focused on safety-sensitive industries, and I think that is the key question. I mean, you know, if you're flying up to Sydney Qantas and you know that your pilot of your 737 inhaled cannabis for their chronic pain 2 hours ago or the night before, how does that make you feel? I mean, that's a question I ask myself. And I would say that, you know, when it comes to these highly safety sensitive positions, we want to ensure that there's a long interval between THC medicine administration and the performance of a safety sensitive task. I think it's reasonable to expect that we have got broad brushstrokes in terms of the amount of time that you should wait before performing driving, for example. But if you're working on a blast site on a mine or driving a train with 500 people on it or flying a 737, maybe we push it out that little bit further just to be sure. But my Qantas pilot, if he or she is using THC for insomnia or pain, I'm quite comfortable with 12 hours. You know, if they used that at 8 p.m. last night and the flight's 8 a.m., I'm fine with that. There's nothing in the literature, and we've comprehensively reviewed that literature that suggests that there's a problem there. So, yeah, as I say, in terms of broad policy, I'm not quite sure how to do this because you're going to capture non-medical use in young people who are, you know, maybe engaging in more risky behaviours. So there's a big difference providing advice to an 18-year-old who's using a lot of cannabis for entertainment purposes versus, you know, a 60-year-old that's using it for their arthritis. So it may not be possible to capture all of these people in one soundbite with policy. But I think the ones we really need to get right at the moment are the people working in these safety-sensitive positions. And we have some ideas about how that might be done.
Thanks, Chair.
Very good. Rachel?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for presenting for us today. I guess what's coming up here is, you know, the very distinctive impairment testing versus testing for presence. And I note that in the Lambert Institute submission, you talk about opportunities for impairment testing and some of the things that you have reviewed, namely being the Druid application. Do you mind talking us through, first of all, what that does test for and what capabilities that has? And is it possible that that could be used as an option for employers to monitor impairment?
Yeah, I mean, we were asked in a recent case to come up with, you know, don't just tell us what the problem is, give us a solution. And I think that's, you know, very important in this space to come up with solutions. And there is no definitive test of impairment, but Druid is quite good. It's a smartphone app. It takes about 2 minutes to administer these tests, which one of which is a balance test. You're holding the phone in your hand and standing on one leg, and it measures your sway through the accelerometer of the phone. Another one is a visual spatial tracking task where you've basically got to move your finger around following a dot on the screen. So these are tests that are sensitive to THC impairment. Now, they're quite useful in as much as you can get a baseline for someone. You administer that test a few times and they show a fairly stable baseline. Then if you get them intoxicated with alcohol or cannabis or some other intoxicant, then their baseline will deviate quite markedly from that sober baseline that you've established. Now, this will never work for roadside drug testing with the police because you need a baseline for everyone in the entire population, which is completely unfeasible. But within, say, the mining industry or the transportation industry, it is quite feasible to actually take a baseline for employees in safety-sensitive tasks and then randomly test them from every now and again to make sure that they're within plus or minus 10% of that baseline. And that was something that we came up with when we provided an expert report to do with an employee in the mining industry who'd been fired for use of a medicinal cannabis product. We also suggested that you may, although oral fluid tests are a little bit unpopular, one thing that oral fluid tests are quite good at is detecting whether you've smoked cannabis in the last 1 or 2 hours, particularly if you get the cutoff quite high. So if you're showing 25 or 50 nanograms per mil of THC in your oral fluid, it's actually quite hard to attribute that to cannabis that you smoked a month ago or last week or even yesterday. So some kind of judicious combination of oral fluid testing with a very high cutoff, 25 or 50 nanograms per mil, plus something looking for a deviation in a Druid test, which only takes about 2 minutes to administer, would be one possible approach to trying to detect impairment medicinal cannabis users. So someone that had taken their product half an hour ago instead of 12 hours ago. And that's probably the best that I can come up with at the moment. I'd be interested to see what Danielle thinks, however.
Oh, no, I have very similar thoughts, Iain. I would agree the combination of some kind of biological test with some kind of functional test is probably the best that we have at the moment. And certainly blood and urine are not good biomarkers. That's not to say that oral fluid is a perfect biomarker either. If you take encapsulated THC, it's not going to show up on an oral fluid test. So there are certainly limitations to those drug tests as well. But when you compare to urine, which I think has already been mentioned, can show a positive test, weeks afterwards, and blood, which is just not practical in the workplace, and also can show a positive test well after use. Oral fluid plus a functional test is probably the best that we are currently looking at least to my knowledge.
And just if I may clarify, so the Druid application, it would measure impairment more broadly. So that could be whether you're affected by alcohol or other drugs, or if you're tired, if you're distracted, if you're grieving, it would monitor that.
Yes, so there's published data on a number of different intoxicants, and that it's certainly good for alcohol and THC and benzodiazepines. Maybe not so much for stimulants, because you can, sometimes your reaction times can be improved and your attentional processes can be improved by stimulants. So I'm not going to vouch for it there. But, the race is on to come up with better methods for assessing cannabis-induced intoxication. There's a number of labs around the world who are looking at this. Druid is probably the best that we've got at the moment, but I'm always going to vote for ingenuity and innovation. I think within the next year or two, we'll be seeing probably a whole load of alternative things that may come along. They may involve eye movement, they may involve subtle changes in balance or fine motor control. We have a few ideas, but they're not ready for prime time yet.
Excellent. Thank you.
One group doing portable brain imaging.
Dr. Sarah Mansfield?
Thank you, and thank you for appearing today. Katinka, I might start with you. We've heard from different submissions and witnesses at the hearings that there is, I guess, a lack of consistency between different pieces of legislation, different bits of regulation, policies around workplace drug testing, and perhaps the approach to alcohol and other drugs issues more broadly in workplaces. What's been your experience of that from your organisation's perspective? Like, is that a difficult, is that something that's difficult to navigate for businesses?
Yes, it is something that is difficult to navigate. And although, you can potentially have an overarching framework that has provides guidelines around this, organizations will have to think through how that potentially would work in their organizations, because especially risks differ per organization. So, while there is a need for overarching guidelines, there also needs to be, thinking through for each organization how that would apply in their context. Having said that, though, I feel that alcohol and other drugs is often something that is a bit scary for organizations because it is so stigmatized, because it is, causes quickly, a big response. But I mean, in a sense, it's not really necessarily different when it comes to mental health. If people have mental health issues, which can, also impact the health and safety in a sense that people can become distracted, what is really important is that organizations like supervisors and managers have the ability to be able to recognize when a worker is not doing well and to sit down with that worker. And in the same way, you would also support someone, who is using alcohol and other drugs, that we create an environment where supervisors and managers can recognize signals like, oh, this person is not doing well. I need to sit down with this person and think about how we can support this person best. So yes, you're right. There's a lot of different policies. I do think that we need some overarching guidance, but organizations will need to think through how that would work best in their situation.
Yeah. And I think earlier we had some questions asking for whether you've seen or whether anyone had examples of organisations that do do this really well. I don't know if you've seen that in your experience at all.
I heard that question and I was thinking I need to look into this. So I will take that on notice and I will get back to you about that to see if we can think of some workplaces that are a good example, because there's nothing that at the moment comes to mind. So if you don't mind, I will take that on notice as well.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We also heard earlier that some businesses feel that, they... that workplace drug testing is something that they implement to limit their, I guess, liability and exposure to risk. And, in the absence of any other guidance around what to do, they take a sort of very cautious approach to a positive test result. It came up particularly in the context of THC. I'd be interested in your sort of views on that, given, that workplaces are worried about, say, there's some accident or something that happens, they've, had a positive THC test, taken, haven't taken sort of a more punitive approach to responding to that, and then being held liable for potentially having, a worker who had detected THC in their system still working, regardless of the question of impairment. They're worried about their exposure to risk. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. So, I mean, I would say in, these high risk, safety sensitive industries, there is something to say about, where testing can play a role to navigate those kind of risks. I mean, I won't go into detail because a lot of people have already discussed that issue of, you're only testing for presence. It doesn't say anything about impairment, so how to then deal with that issue. But I do think that in general, for, most workplaces, you can navigate that risk without needing to do testing, as long as if you have an appropriate policy in place. Because, mental health can also cause I keep coming back to that, but that is also can cause a significant risk. But there's not something that we can test that says, oh, you tested positive for a mental health issue, so we need to now sit down for this. So for most workplaces, if you have a clear policy in place, that should be that outlines the procedures around alcohol and other drugs as well, that should be then sufficient to navigate that risk.
Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I first of all just get a sense from Danielle and Iain? In your submission, you pretty comprehensively critique both oral and urine samples and such like. And we're obviously at that point in the inquiry where we're keen to try and get answers. So can I just confirm what you're suggesting is that if there is a combination of oral testing and Druid-style testing, what we're covering with the oral is the presence, but also possibly how recently it's been consumed. And then we're matching that with an impairment test via something like Druid that gives you a sort of a balanced overview of the whole question. Is that a reasonable characterisation?
I think so. I mean, we have some very good data from a number of different labs, not just ours, looking at the probability of giving, say, a 25 nanogram per mil THC oral fluid test at various time points after consumption of cannabis. And it really, there's an ever diminishing likelihood once you get past 3 hours of reaching that level. So that tells us that if you're trying to capture someone who's very recently consumed a lot of cannabis, then that might be a feasible way of doing it. However, it doesn't at all correlate with impairment. You could actually be 50 nanograms per mil in your oral fluid and have smoked a considerable amount of cannabis in the past hour. But there's no guarantee that you're not fit for duty if you're a regular user. So that's where the conjunction with a test of functional impairment might be quite useful. So if you tick both boxes, then you probably shouldn't be undertaking safety-sensitive tasks.
Okay, thank you. That's terrific. Can I just pick you up on that last term? I mean, we've heard lots of reference to high risk and safety sensitive. Is there any sort of definitional set that says to us, well, this industry or this vocation is safety sensitive or high risk? Are you cognizant of any sort of thing you can point the committee to that would give us some definitions in that regard?
I mean, you get into the area of occupational medicine, which is not my strong point, but there probably are definitions to be had in that particular area of medicine.
Could I ask you maybe to
Certainly
take that as a question on notice, Iain?
Yes, that's right. I will mention that we, in the Canadian cases at least, we locked horns with a number of specialists in occupational medicine who are extremely conservative. One real hallmark of conservatism in this space is where people are asking for a ban in safety-sensitive workplaces for people that are using CBD-only medications. And that was happening in one of the Canadian cases I was involved in, and also in a mining industry case I was involved in WA. And that is really counter to all scientific knowledge. I mean, Danielle's done studies where she's given 1,500 milligrams of CBD and done extensive tests of driving and cognitive function, and you just don't see any impairment whatsoever. So the extreme conservatism can kind of move into areas that are really quite dark in terms of there's no evidence whatsoever for what these people are asserting. Their safety sensitivity goes so far as to be preposterous, and it's very important to call that out because it impacts people who are medicines.
I'd like to get one more question if I could, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Iain. Katinka, can I ask you a question? You talked about the importance of testing, however done, occurring in an appropriate context of policies and procedures. And we've had a lot of evidence about the absence of appropriate policies and procedures and the fact that there's very little or nothing from WorkSafe or other authorities to guide employers. Is there a framework or some exemplars that you could provide to the committee about if there was to be something put into guidelines or resource materials for employers as to what that would, or does it exist, and can you point to it, or would you like to take it as a question on notice?
I will have to take that as a question on notice. A lot of our work is for internal purposes. So let me have a think about that and come back to you, because I agree that it would be very beneficial to have some frameworks that could guide us as well.
That'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Just minding on time, Dr. Heath, you got any question you want to put on notice? Because we've got one more to go. Or you want to?
No, thank you. That's been extremely helpful.
Yep, thank you. Professor, doctors, it's like you said, don't come with a solution, come with an answer. So I think what you present today, it's remarkable, and it will give us a good insight lesson to various recommendations, what we will put forward later on. I just want to ask you, with your research and surveys and etc. you've done regarding testing, could you able to provide us with the data and research results, Professor or Danielle?
I didn't hear the question. Danielle, would you like to take that one?
I believe the question was, can we provide data and things like that, where we can certainly share published data and publications and things like that.
Yep.
There are some things, I can't remember if we've mentioned any unpublished data in that submission. I don't think that we have, although we have mentioned a couple of unpublished things
Yes.
right now today. We probably can't share all of that information, but we can certainly share published things and maybe some bits and pieces from any unpublished things.
Yes,
Yeah.
whatever you can, it'll be much appreciated on all the research you've done. Again, thank you so much for your time, and I'll just appreciate it. Could I ask Hansard to suspend recording?